Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of SciComm and COVID-19 chats. We're super excited today to have Dr. Jonathan Wosen, fellow Stanford alum. So it was great to see alums out there. And I'm especially excited to talk to him because he's a science journalist out there right now on the field covering COVID-19. And we really want to get to sort of his experience covering COVID-19, some of the things he's seeing and some of the things he's not seeing, for example, and learn more about some of the projects that he's working on. And I think this is a nice add-on to the rest of our discussions from our guests who are also on the field doing diverse projects. And so he'll have an interesting meta perspective, if you will, of some of the things that he's seeing. And so Dr. Wosen got his PhD from Stanford. He's done myriad of internships, which I hope he'll tell us about. I don't want to steal the thunder. And now he's at Noble Magazine, if I'm correct in saying that, in Palo Alto, California. Dr. Wosen, welcome. Please add on to my little description about you. Can you add on anything else? Who are you? Tell us a little bit more, and then we'll get going.
Sure. So very happy to be here to have this conversation with you. So I sort of by training for most of my life was in the sciences and did a PhD in immunology at Stanford, and kind of figured out midway through graduate school that the things that made me happiest were explaining and sharing science with people who weren't already experts. And so started learning more about science communication and what would it mean to be a science writer, to be a science journalist. So did some internships on the East Coast, wrote for Stat News in Boston, for those of you guys who are familiar with a lot of the biotech and pharma coverage they do, and wrote for some newspapers, Santa Cruz Sentinel out on the West Coast. Did an internship for Stanford Medicine right after getting my PhD, and then was previously, but recently at Noble Magazine, which is a online magazine in Palo Alto. As of, I guess, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I actually have a job now. I write for the San Diego Union-Tribune, which is the daily newspaper. So I'm resuming while I'm in San Diego. So I'm the biotech reporter. I write about the biotech industry, and San Diego is one of the 3 hubs, you could say, right up there with the San Francisco Bay Area and also the Cambridge, Boston area.
Oh, right. Fantastic. Yeah. So very diverse. So tell us a little bit, you are on the field out there during this COVID-19. What have you seen, and what are you seeing? What kind of projects have you been working on?
Yeah, so it's interesting. First of all, starting a job in journalism during this very bizarre time where we're all working from home, and there's an active pandemic going on. And it's also interesting to have been a scientist for so many years, and now to be on the other side of thinking about science, but doing it as a reporter. And I think one of the things I'm seeing that's even difficult for me, and I can only imagine for a lot of our readers, is that this is a really fluid situation. So you kind of wake up every morning and turn on your television or go to the New York Times, wherever you get your news from, and it feels like there's a couple of new updates which might agree with something you read the other week, or maybe it's going in a different direction. And there was a lot of mixed messaging about whether people should be wearing masks, not wearing masks, covering their faces, not covering their faces. Is COVID-19 like the flu? Is that a useful comparison? How much more deadly is it? What's the right balance between conveying how serious the situation is versus maybe going too far in terms of causing people to constantly be afraid and anxious in a way that they can't really do anything about. So the main thing that I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis is that there's just a lot of information, and frankly, it's even hard for those of us who are in the news business to keep track of what's being said when. And we first got in touch with each other because you were doing a really nice flyer on how to keep track of how to know whether a source is credible. When you're seeing all these things being circulated from friends and family or on Facebook or Twitter, wherever. So I'm just seeing a lot of information, and I'm seeing that there's a real need for people who have the ability to help readers, help the rest of us make sense of what's coming in. So sometimes the stories I've written that have done well aren't even necessarily the stories about a biotech company that's doing X, Y, and Z or has some clinical trial that they're getting off the ground. It's actually a story that sort of steps back from the daily news and helps you understand what is an antibody and why are we talking about antibodies so much. So I think one of my first stories was basically 5 things you should know about antibodies, starting with what they are, why scientists are studying them in COVID-19, and what they might be able to tell us about how you make a vaccine, or can you use these antibodies from people that have survived disease to treat people who still have it? And can we use antibody testing to figure out how many people have already been infected and potentially who might be protected going forward? Which kind of leads me to another point about how one of the interesting things, especially coming from the sciences and knowing how long it takes to conclude anything. It takes so many years. And that process usually is happening inside of laboratories in pharma, in academia, and very much isolated from public discourse. All this stuff is happening in real time, and then it's getting broadcast to the public, usually without a whole lot of nuance. There are so many things that are being done based off of preprint observations that the scientific community really hasn't had a chance to peer review. So this is all, the information's coming out really quickly. And I think for people who don't usually, or don't really see how the sausage gets made in terms of the scientific process, it can be a little confusing when scientists don't have all the answers immediately, or when there's some initial evidence that points to a particular drug maybe being helpful, and then there's a larger study that actually has controls and is randomized that then contradicts that. So I think that's part of the challenge for us as reporters to help not just tell people what's going on, but help them make sense of it. And so, a little bit of that is, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, like, how you mentioned speed.
Yeah.
Things coming fast, and then at the same time, how do you end up then deciding what to cover, right? So 2 questions there is like speed. How do you guys as science reporters deal with that? And then how do you then make the decision on what to cover?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just answer the second part first. I don't know why. They're both good questions. So when I wake up and start my workday, generally I open my inbox and I've got a whole bunch of emails from all these different PR people in the biotech world, and they're all something along the lines of, hey, this is our company, we're doing, the greatest thing ever, please write a story. And I can, generally, a lot of those I will kind of ignore or I'll skim. So I'm looking for a couple of things when I'm looking through those pitches, and this is a little bit different. If you're a freelancer, it's different because you're usually, part of your job is to go out there and find the stories, which I have to do too, but part of my challenge is just sifting through or filtering through the stuff that's coming in. So I'm looking for stories that speak to issues that are relevant and understandable to the general public, because I write for a local newspaper. So my my audience, these aren't scientists necessarily. They're not people who have a PhD or people who've necessarily thought about some of these topics much since high school biology class, for example. So, I have to make sure that the stories I'm writing address the things they care about, which come down to, if I get sick, are there medicines that can treat me? Do they have side effects? How do we know that some of these potential therapies work, or do we not know? So I really have to make sure that I'm on the same wavelength with my readers in that way. And there's a lot of science that's important, but it's incremental, and it doesn't necessarily need to be conveyed to the public right now. So, I have to sort of separate the part of my training or the part of my brain that might get excited about something and step back and think about whether it's actually interesting to other people. So if there's is a paper about a crystal structure necessarily something that I need to write about? And does this story, is it timely? Does it fit in with current issues, current questions? So if I'm seeing a lot in the news about, for example, the fact that there are like hundreds of different coronavirus tests, I'm going to be looking for stories that can help explain to the reader what these tests are. So we did a graphic, which is actually a really good way to get information across right now, because those things are very, very shareable and they're very easy to digest. So we just did a graphic that breaks down, what are the different types of coronavirus testing. So what are these tests where they're putting a cotton swab up your nose? Why are they doing that? What can you learn from that? What can't you learn from that? How long does it take to get results? How does that compare to an antibody test? What are these antigen tests that are coming out? So yeah, I guess to answer your question, so I'm trying to put myself in the reader's shoes and thinking about what they would be interested in hearing. As far as speed, that's kind of one of the challenges. Sometimes we have really short deadlines. Some of the stories I'll write are very short because I just want to get this little tidbit of news out there. So I don't need the whole day to write a 300-word story about a particular announcement from the FDA. I can do that in an hour-ish, with some editing and stuff. So the speed, it just comes from doing quick stories. It comes from, over time, not worrying too much about things sounding, like some perfect Pulitzer Prize story. We're just trying to share information with the community.
Right. And so how do you deal with the misinformation that may be out there, right? The consumer, like other people, the public are getting so much. What's your role in that, and how do you how do you deal with the misinformation that's out there? Do you try to combat it directly, or I'm curious how from your end, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess one thing I try to pay attention to is whether or not the particular message is gaining a lot of traction. So, everybody has sort of their own individual questions and sort of hypotheses about, I get emails from readers sometimes in response to a story who will say, oh, I was really sick X number of years ago. I took this particular drug and I feel better. Can you please write a story about that, or can you please get the word out? And I don't really feel the need to write a piece in a newspaper that's going out to everybody in San Diego County and up on the World Wide Web addressing that point, unless it's something that is coming up over and over again. So I'm sort of looking for messages, ideas, information, or misinformation that is coming up often enough that it merits a story. Because part of the challenge is there are a million different stories you could write, so you have to like we've been talking about, you have to figure out which ones are the ones that are most impactful and interesting and timely. So I don't, yeah, actually it's an interesting question too, because so I had gotten an email, speaking of all the emails I get from some folks in the stem cell world, which I guess you guys are a stem cell, or you're the STEM Institute. Fair enough. But there are a lot of these small stem cell focused clinics and organizations in this country, and in California in particular, and some of them are, I think, fair to say, more credible than others, and so and some of them are now trying to move into the COVID-19 space with some early stage clinical trials. So I had thought about doing something to address that head on, and I still might, depending on how much press they generate for themselves. But I also have to weigh the value of stories like that maybe are skeptical of something that's going on, and maybe are more along the lines of addressing misinformation. And so that's maybe a story it's structured in more of a, I don't want to say negative way, but there are all these positive developments that I could also be covering. So it's tricky, and sometimes I go back and forth about what's the right thing to cover, but it always comes down to will this story do enough to address readers' questions, and hopefully many readers with one story, right?
I see. And how do you assess impact from your side? Is when you publish a story, you're looking at how many viewers actually read it, or is the engagement? If you're keeping track of it, how do you do so?
Yeah, I mean, so social media is one indication. Some of the stories that we write end up getting picked up by other newspapers, other publications, or sort of getting retweeted by scientists, and that gives them a whole new life of their own. And then just anecdotally, I mean, if readers like a story, they'll tell you. If they don't like it, sometimes they'll tell you as well. So I haven't spent too much time looking at the readership metrics, although that's more because I'm still relatively new here. So I'm going to wait a little longer just for people to know that I'm here and that I'm writing stories, and then maybe the numbers will be a little more of a better indicator of who's actually finishing the stories, who's reading them, and then actually subscribing to the newspaper, which, at least from our perspective, is pretty important to the whole enterprise. So social media, notes from readers, seeing if a story gets picked up by other publications, and then eventually I'll also be looking at the actual metrics that we have.
Yeah, so I can tell you from Boston, we know you there. So
that's good. That's good.
So the stories are getting out. And so what do you see as the future, right? So you do mostly written text. Do you do any video, or all written types of pieces?
Personally, I do written stuff. I've worked a few times now with our graphics and illustration team, and they do a really nice job of taking some of the ideas that are hard to just write about, and they'll have really elegant and clear visuals, and so that's, anytime we get to work with them, I'm always excited, and they like working with us too. But I do written stuff, and I'll sort of sketch out a graphic, and then the graphics team will take it from there. As far as other communication media, when I was working at Stat News, they had and still have a really good video team as well. And so I think Hannah Armitage at Stat, who I got to know a little bit during my internship there, she's been doing some really nice explainer videos on COVID-19 and on immunity. I think long term that, that might be, but that's probably the direction that a lot of communication and journalism might be headed towards. I mean, you don't necessarily, first of all, everybody's attention spans are getting shorter. I mean, that's common knowledge. You don't necessarily need the traditional written out long story to get your points across. So if you can say something in 300 words instead of 1,000, you probably should. If you can say something in kind of a listicle format, you should be open to doing that. Or Q&As are another way to take a story and break it up into little discrete chunks that the reader can digest. So even on the written side of things, there are things that we can and are doing to try to engage readers in a different way versus the way that we might typically write sort of a long standard news story. But yeah, I think videos, animation, photos, those are things that increasingly are going to be important.
And ultimately, I guess the readers and the consumers will sort of push that angle, or what are they gravitating more towards, right? Video is very popular, of course, but people are still reading, thankfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's always good. But are there patterns right now? Video, I know, is sort of there, right? Very powerful. Are you seeing like things like AI in terms of automating some of this communication? And if that's true, what are anyway, what are your concerns or support?
Yeah, so I guess that there are a few directions that are interesting. One of those is, well, and this is like a lot of aspects, I guess, of society, especially in Silicon Valley and also over in Cambridge, but the use of coding, the implementation of data and coding in journalism. So, traditionally as a journalist, if you wanted to look through government documents to find certain data points, you might have to basically have a giant stack of paper and read all of those things one by one. And then sometimes, unfortunately, you still have to do that. But there are all these tools in the computer programming world to analyze data quickly, summarize it, plot it. So BuzzFeed, they do a really good job of that. They got a great graphics team. So Peter Aldhouse, who's a science reporter at BuzzFeed, he's actually somebody who teaches classes on how to do that. So I've taken some of his classes when I was a student at UC Santa Cruz. They have a science communication program at UC Santa Cruz that I was in. So I think, being able to tell stories through data and to visualize data. So, all these maps, for example, to help you understand how prevalent COVID is in certain parts of the country as scaled by population, how that changes over time. I think that's definitely a big future direction, and it's sort of already a direction for journalism. So I'd point to that as one specific example.
I think the data side of things, I think the New York Times, they do those visuals there, and I think they are very powerful. One little snippet, you can see the whole pattern before you.
Yeah, kind of tells you everything you need to know. Sometimes it is the story. I mean, they had a graphic on how long vaccines historically have taken, and compared that to how long people have been saying, the 12 to 18 month timeline, which would easily be the fastest vaccine in history by leaps and miles. But to actually see that represented on a chart is words really can't quite capture that.
Right. Dr. Wosen, this was fantastic. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I think we barely surfaced, and that was the point. For those of you who are interested to learn more, I will put all the links to his website, to his CV down below, so please do check that. Is there a place, you want to add anything? If people want to learn more, where can they go? I know you're on Twitter and all these things. We'll add at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, if you want, I guess, to learn more about some of the things I'm writing, you could, well, probably the most up-to-date thing would be to go to Twitter at Jonathan Wosen. I'm sure we'll have the spelling on that somewhere in the bottom. If you want to see things I've written previously, you can just go to jonathanwosen.com. If you have particular COVID-related story ideas, which, you know, I'm always open to, you could go to jonathan.wosen at sduniontribune.com. So we can have that one down there as well. And otherwise, just very happy to be here. And thanks for the conversation. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And look forward to another edition very soon with a new guest.